welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Kathryn Weathersby. Kathryn is a visiting fellow at the US Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins University and a fellow at the Institute for Contemporary Asian Studies. But perhaps more pertinent to this interview itself, Kathryn has also been the director of a long-running project at the Woodrow Wilson Center to look into the opening of old communist archives. These archives have opened up a tremendous insight into North Korea. Now, of course, information about North Korea and the internal decisions that it makes are extremely hard to come by. But if we roll back time, they were communicating with old Soviet bloc countries. They were receiving aid and they were coordinating policies. And from these rare archives, we begin to get a vision of the events surrounding the division of Korea. Now, of course, today the Korean peninsula is divided along the 38th parallel, North Korea and South Korea. And for many people, there's a fairly uncontroversial history around this. The Soviet Union occupied the North, the Americans occupied the South, they imposed their particular form of government, and sure, with time it evolves and it changes, but that, for many people, is the reason we see the division today. But what is missing in all of this is just what is happening behind the scenes, and why certain decisions were made, what factors led into them, and the overall security analysis that the two major powers took in this regard. And of course, looming over all of this is China and the decisions they made themselves. Now, Korea is originally divided almost by default. After the defeat of the German army, it is America who takes the central role in the warfighting capabilities for the final battle against the Japanese Empire. And of course, at this time, Japan holds the Korean peninsula. The Americans push the Soviet Union. They implore them to enter the war and open up a new front, push down into Japan and Korea and open a new front against a Japanese enemy that were holding out against tremendous odds and desperate to avoid unconditional surrender. Now, America are desperate to take Korea just as they are to take the Japanese islands. But the Japanese islands ring around the Korean peninsula. So without taking these islands first, it's incredibly hard to jump beyond them and open up a new dimension to the war. And America see Japan at the time not just as an enemy, but as one of the very few countries in the world at that time that had global warfighting capabilities. A positive relationship with the future Japanese nation was in America's interest. It's what they had their eyes on at this time. Sure, they had to win the war, but more importantly, they had to make sure that Japan would never again be a launching pad towards America, and if anything, it could be a launching pad for where America could move into the Cold War itself. On the other side of this, the Soviet Union were willing to sit back and let America exhaust their resources until it became apparent that America were going to break through at some point. It was inevitable. It wasn't obvious when, but it was coming. And as Stalin turned his gaze towards this specific conflict, he began to see the strategic importance of Korea. He didn't necessarily want to hold the peninsula, but he did want to make sure that it had a friendly government. He had already seen a hostile Japan invade Korea and then move its troops from there north into Manchuria and across into China, and he could see the future playing out in a similar way. A hostile Korean government allied with America and with Japan could very well become its own launching pad, not at America, but this time as a railroad for war into the Soviet Union and into the Russian heartland. So in a way, a compromise was found. Russia needed to find a way to ensure a friendly government in at least the northern part of the Korean peninsula. And America needed to make sure that Japan and its former colonies were on its side in this gradually emerging Cold War. So agreements are made at Potsdam, lines are drawn, the Soviet Union invade, they stop at the 38th parallel and wait for a whole month for American troops to arrive. And this, for many people, is the end of the division issue. This says it all. But there is much more to come. China play a very significant role in all of this. And of course, there's the looming shadows of two great figures here, Sung Man-rhee in the south and Kim Il-sung in the north. The decisions that these two make and the absolute conviction of each one to rule the entire peninsula heavily plays into this issue. Finally, of course, there's the Korean War. And this becomes an issue onto itself when we talk about the division of Korea. There is just so much to unpack here, so much small detail, so much intrigue, so much behind the scenes decision making that we just don't see and just don't hear, and that we are now lucky enough to have access to through the opening of these old communist archives and the work of Kathryn Weathersby. So without digging too much deeper into it, I'll let Kathryn, through the course of this podcast, explain it for us. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account attached to this podcast, www.patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. So, without any further delay, this is Kathryn Weathersby. Kathryn Weathersby, welcome to the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you very much.
Great. So, today we're going to be speaking about the division of Korea into South Korea and North Korea. But I think it's probably best just to go back a little bit and ask the question about these old Russian and communist archives, because you've done an awful lot of work in these rare sort of archives, rare access to information. So what exactly are they, and how do they come about, and why they're so important to this issue?
Well, they're the government archives of the Soviet Union, so just like any government, but especially like authoritarian ones, they kept very detailed records, and they also cataloged them very carefully, cross-indexed them very carefully. So these are the records generated by various officials in the Soviet government that were involved in Korea in one way or another, either people on the ground here. I'm speaking from Seoul, so I'll say here in Korea. People who were military officers during the occupation, or who were embassy officials later after Soviet troops were gone, or whoever they might be, or back in Moscow, people who were responsible for Korea policy in the Foreign Ministry or in the Ministry of Defense or in the Communist Party apparatus. The Communist Party, for example, had an international department that dealt with relations with foreign communist parties. Those records are quite an interesting bit of documentation about North Korea, because every interaction they had with North Korean communists, or Korean communists, wherever they were actually on the peninsula, was recorded. So conversations, correspondence, and so forth. The officials in the party in Moscow were responsible for the Korean party, just as they were responsible in the early years for communist parties everywhere. So you see that they did things like edit the speeches of Kim Il-sung. You see their blue pencil, going over the text and making changes. And they even decided the order of events in a rally or a parade, or, so they were it was their job to closely guide the actions of communist parties elsewhere, because they were the leader of the revolutionary movement. That's the way it was set up.
And of course, I think in some way this is our only real insight into some of the decision making inside North Korea, because of course they're not publishing this sort of information themselves.
Yes, that's right. So, absent the North Korean side, you have two sides of a conversation, right? So you can at least have the records of one side. That doesn't tell you everything. They don't have the internal discussions within the Korean party, the discussions between Korean political officers. That's not going to be found in the Russian archives. But any interaction they had with the Soviets, which was, vast, both because the Soviets were occupying Korea and then were serving as the chief patron, the country that was keeping it alive, and was the model for what it wanted to be. So it was an extremely close interaction. But also because, as I mentioned before, the Soviets were, they were responsible for what was happening. So they monitored and interacted very closely.
So with that as a flag post, let's jump into this issue of the division of Korea. So I guess it's important at this point to go back to the colonial period, just as a sort of guidepost where we come from. And I saw you mentioning something that you read recently, or something you were speaking about recently. You said it's not a great creation myth for South Korea, but it does begin at this time of Japanese colonization.
Yeah, it's interesting. It ends up in a different creation myth in the South and the North. In the North, Korean communists did go in large numbers, tens of thousands, to China to fight against Japan, together with Chinese communists. And so the North is able to use that story as its foundation myth, which works quite well. Kim Il-sung was a relatively minor figure in that struggle. He had maybe 200 men under his control and was responsible for a couple of significant actions, not much more than that. And then he fled into the Soviet Union in 1941 to escape capture by Japanese forces. And so spent from 41 to 45 in a camp outside Khabarovsk in Siberia with the other Koreans who had fled there and Chinese. There were some 60 or so of them. They were being trained in a Soviet Army camp there. They became members of the Soviet Army. So that's why he was chosen to head the North Korean state as it was being created, because the Soviets knew him. As simple as that. They didn't know the people who had remained behind in Korea during the Japanese period, and they didn't know the people who were further into China fighting with the Chinese communists. But they knew this small group of people who were in their own camp, and they knew they were loyal to them. So they were the best bet.
So as we walk this forward now, so of course it's from Japan that America come into the war or get a focus on Korea itself, because of course as Germany are being defeated and as Japan are still there holding on to the last man, it is America that takes the lead in this war fighting capability in this situation. So they come to the Korean peninsula, the Korean issue, through Japan itself, and in a sense they are cordoned off. The Japanese islands, in a sense, ring around South Korea, and it's just something that they want to get to, but they have to defeat Japan first.
Yes, well, it's more, they don't particularly, want to get to Korea. They want to defeat Japan. That's the goal from December 41 on. So the U.S. is engaged in an enormous war to defeat Japan, covering all of East Asia. So they start from the south and move their way up north slowly, painfully, island by island. It was such a difficult war. So then they anticipated that they would have to occupy the home islands of Japan before the Japanese army would surrender. And just looking at the map, when I talk about this, I always have a big map of Northeast Asia up on the screen, because everything that happened flows from the map. It's quite obvious if you just kind of look at it. Yes. As the American forces are moving up toward Kyushu, right, the southernmost Japanese island, they can't actually land on the Korean peninsula very safely as long as they don't have control of Kyushu, because Japanese planes from Kyushu can easily intercept them, and ships from Kyushu can intercept them. But the U.S. was allied with the Soviet Union in the war against Germany. So the most obvious thing in the world is to request that the Soviet army come across the Trans-Siberian Railroad to the northern edge of Manchuria, and then just simply come down overland into Manchuria, taking care of the Japanese forces in Manchuria, and then continue down into Korea. And that's precisely what the Americans asked the Soviets to do from the day after Pearl Harbor onward. They were persistently asking the Soviets to enter the war against Japan. We need you to come down into Manchuria and to defeat the Guangdong army there, and then move down into Korea. So that's what was agreed by the military officers. It was pretty simple. Yes. Of course they would want that, right? And the Soviets wanted to enter the war because they wanted to regain the territory they had lost to Japan after the War of 1904-05. They wanted southern Sakhalin Island and the ports in Manchuria and the railroad through Manchuria, and they also wanted the Kurils Islands north of Hokkaido. So, in order to get those things, they needed to enter the war against Japan. So it was a priority for Moscow as well. They were willing to do it as soon wanting to do it as soon as Germany was defeated. So that's what they did. So that's why Soviets are in North Korea in the first place. It's to defeat the Japanese, and because they could get there much more easily than the Americans.
And of course, hovering over all this, it's is this specter, and I don't think people fully appreciate just what the fear was at this time, that there was a fear on both sides, but particularly inside the Soviet side, just on proximity, that a newly militarized Japan would soon enough rise up again. And of course, people take for granted that might be a misconception, but the First World War wasn't that long before the Second World War, and it wasn't inconceivable that if you waited a couple of decades, the whole situation would repeat itself again.
Well, exactly, because that's what had just happened in their lifetime. Germany was defeated in World War I, and then it remilitarized and then created an even bigger war. So, yes, they expected that would happen. Actually, both sides did. So that's why the Americans were determined to hold on to control of Japan. And they did after the war, determined to rebuild Japan in their own image so that this wouldn't happen. The Soviets were worried about the United States being the only power that was going to rebuild Japan, because Japan was a capitalist country, and so was the U.S., so they assumed that once Japan got, kind of rebuilt from the war, that it would be on the American side if they weren't able to strengthen the Communist Party in Japan. And so they were afraid that this newly energized Japan in future years would join the Americans and together attack the Soviet Far East. And they would do that using Japan as the land bridge. Using Korea as the land bridge. That's been Korea's unhappy fate throughout its history, to be the way to get from the Asian mainland to Japan, or from Japan to the Asian mainland, in either direction. And so therefore the big powers on the mainland and Japan have always been concerned about what kind of government is in Korea, what the situation is in Korea, because it's a buffer state.
So talking about that buffer state there, so America pushes the Soviet Union to get involved in this war quite early, and they resist at first until they've defeated, until they're satisfied with their conflict on the Western Front. But Stalin soon enough realizes, as you're saying there, that Korea and Japan do matter, and he begins he doesn't so much want to colonize Korea or even the northern half of the Korean peninsula, but he wants a friendly government in there.
Exactly. It needs to be a reliable buffer, right? Which means that it needs to be a country that will resist some kind of attack from Japan via Korea. So it needs to be reliably friendly to the Soviet Union. Now, what does that mean? Well, in the end, the Soviet system didn't really allow for very much nuance. It was not that sort of system. So to be reliably friendly, you really needed to be pretty tightly controlled by Moscow. So, so that was the goal. However, what made it so complicated with Korea, and really essentially why it ended up divided, was that was a secondary goal for Stalin. The first goal, overwhelmingly, was getting some kind of control over Japan itself. He considered at first landing troops in Hokkaido, ended, at the last minute decided not to do that, and then pressed for greater Soviet representation in the occupation authority for Japan, in the Allied Control Council. The Americans kept resisting that, but until the end of November of 1945, Moscow was still hoping for a better settlement regarding Japan that would give them more control. And as long as they were doing that, Korea was part of the bargaining leverage right? They were going to give Americans a bit of what they wanted in Korea, hoping that would give them some kind of bargaining advantage over Japan. So I think that's why when Americans came up with this last-minute idea on August 10, right after the Soviets entered Korea, right after they entered the war against Japan, to create two occupation zones, Now, we had agreed at Potsdam that Manchuria and Korea were, in the Soviet zone for ground operations. That's what we'd been wanting them to do for years. But now, suddenly, because of what the Soviets had done in Eastern Europe in establishing a communist government for Poland, another key buffer state, contrary to the agreements that it had made with the British and the Americans, and contrary to the wishes of the Polish people, the American political officers looked at that situation of Korea and said, oh, this is going to be the Poland of the East. We don't want that to happen. We don't want a communized Korea peninsula to be so close to Japan. That would strengthen the Japanese Communist Party. And so therefore, let's get American forces in control of at least a part of the peninsula. We can't get them there physically right away, but let's propose to the Soviets that in this general order number one that's working out how the surrender of Japan is going to be managed, let's propose that Korea be divided into two occupation zones so that the Soviets would take care of the surrender of Japanese troops only north of the 38th parallel, and U.S. forces, once they finally get to Korea, will do that job south of the 38th parallel. So this proposal was sent along with, all the other proposals of General Order Number 1 to Stalin, and he simply didn't have any comment about it. He just accepted this sudden change of plan without any discussion.
So
he had a couple of other points he talked about, but not that. And I think the reason is, although we don't have hard evidence that this was his reasoning, but it appears that he did that, and because of this very elaborate game of chess he was playing with the Americans. We move here, they move there, we move here, they move there, we check them here, they move there, to try to get the territorial configuration that was most important to him. So you give a bit here, you take a bit there, And as part of those calculations, then he was willing to allow the Americans to occupy the southern part of Korea.
So you've touched on a couple of things there that we might unpack just a little bit here. So you mentioned Potsdam, that first one. So let's go to Potsdam and look into that, because when you speak to people who've just brushed over this, they will say things like there was a secret deal that they comprised at Potsdam. But at least my understanding that is that this just wasn't the case. And if there but there were some deals in terms of ground forces and air forces and things like this.
Yeah, before Potsdam, at the Yalta conference in February, Potsdam was July and August. So, but before that, the big conference at Yalta, as German surrender was imminent, the Allies were talking about all kinds of things, but one of them was Soviet entry into the war against Japan. The U.S. wanted to confirm that the Soviets would enter within 6 months after the defeat of Germany. So they talked about that, and in the course of talking about that, Roosevelt raised with Stalin in a private conversation his idea about creating a trusteeship for Korea, four-party trusteeship. For the British, the Chinese, the Soviets, and the Americans to jointly cooperate in creating a new government for Korea to take the place of Japanese government. Well, Stalin, was willing to consider that idea and sort of tentatively voiced his approval of it, but they didn't work out any of the details. Roosevelt wanted that kind of arrangement, ironically, because he thought it would avoid a conflict over Korea. The history of the late 19th century, early 20th century was that the great powers of Northeast Asia fought over Korea because of its strategic location as a buffer state. And so, looking at the post-war world, he anticipated a new fight over Korea, involving the Soviets and the Chinese, probably. And he wanted to avoid that. And so that's, the reason he came up with this trusteeship proposal. So Stalin, more or less agreed to that, but they didn't work out what this would actually mean. But then at Potsdam, this is July, so Germany has surrendered, and now it's time to get down to the nitty-gritty of Soviet entry into the war against Japan. So it's primarily military officers who are discussing that, and they're just working out the details of how they're going to cooperate in their military operations. The political officers were also at the conference at Potsdam, and they were voicing concern about Korea to President Truman along the lines I just mentioned, that if the Korean Peninsula is under Soviet occupation, they're going to create a communist government there, just like they did for Poland. And then we're going to have this communist government really close to Japan, and that's going to be very dangerous. But nothing actually happened at Potsdam with regard to that. Truman listened to their concerns, but no decision was made. There was only the military decision that Manchuria and Korea would be the Soviet zone for ground operations.
So, hovering over all of this is this specter of nuclear weapons, and of course that's incredibly prescient for what we're looking at today. But if you go back there, now I've seen you mention this, and this is an interesting part of this. It must have played into the Soviet psyche, at least in some way, that there's a common story out there, and of course it must be partly true, that the dropping of the two bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were an important moment in making Japan surrender, and then of course leading into the division of Korea. But there was also another factor that at least some prominent historians are coming out with now, that it wasn't so much the bombs, but it was the recognition that the Russians were invading from the north. And you got to choose who you surrendered to. Did you want to unconditionally surrender to America, or did you want to unconditionally surrender to Russia? And of course, that's the image that you get there of choosing your future government.
Yes, there's a wonderful book by a Japanese-American historian, Hasegawa is his name, Toshio Hasegawa, called Racing the Enemy, about these few weeks at the end of the war. And exactly that's what was happening because of the dropping of the American bomb on Japan. The war was about to end quickly. And so then this big race began. The Soviets needed to get into the war more quickly than they thought they were going to get into the war, because they needed to be in it before it ended so that they could get their territorial gains. Japan, at least the political leadership in Japan, was very eager to surrender to the Americans and not the Soviets. Also the Soviets were rushing to get control of the Kurils before the Americans could land forces there. There was a lot of rushing happening because suddenly the war is about to end. Before that, they thought it would last for another year or so. Hasegawa argues, based on his study of Japanese sources and Soviet sources, that it was actually the entry of 1.5 million well-equipped Soviet forces pouring over the border into Manchuria that was the last blow for the Japanese. It's still not quite definitive whether that's the case or not, but surely it played a big role. The Japanese had already endured just grotesque levels of bombing. The firebombing of Tokyo killed more people than the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They had persisted despite that, but they couldn't hold, they simply couldn't manage against this massive Soviet army coming down to destroy their key forces in Manchuria and Korea. So, that was important, for whatever reason, but it's important for Korea because it means that all this was happening very quickly. Decisions were made late at night, spur of the moment. We need to get American forces in southern Korea. Okay, what will be our proposed dividing line? Well, let's make it 38th parallel. Okay, that's what we'll do. So all of this is, and huge issues are at stake. The concerns on the part of the big powers are not about Korea itself, but about the larger issues of their own strategic position. And then, what happened in Korea happened just in the course of this.
So let's swing this back to Korea now. So that's effectively the end of the war there in many ways. And this is an important moment in this where the Russians invade Korea first and that they stop on the 38th parallel and wait for a full month for the Americans to meet. So the opportunity was there, but they waited for a full month on that parallel waiting for American forces.
Yeah. I think, again, it's because Stalin was so focused on Japan. And he really wanted to get the Americans to agree to a bigger Soviet role in the occupation of Japan. So he's willing to accept this American proposal for Korea.
So on either side of that division, so shortly after they draw that line and shortly after it becomes a normative standard there, both sides begin to, I guess, politicize. And it is the North that is much, much quicker at this, much more ready to create its own provisional government. The South, very early on, is in many ways in disarray. Of course, they eventually, Sungman-Rhee comes into power there, but it is there's much less planning being done, and they're much less ready for government on the southern side of this very early division.
Yes, absolutely. The Soviets were so much more organized. They were so much clearer about what they wanted. Well, they had a particular program. Soviet-style state is a very clearly defined way of doing things. So they, once they decided to set up a Soviet-style state, it was quite straightforward what you needed to do. You carried out land reform, and then you nationalize industry and banks, and then you institute labor laws and all sorts of other laws. You create social organizations, and you create a dual structure of government and party, and there you are. I mean, everybody kind of knows this is what you do. So they simply set out to do that. The Americans were, didn't know what they were going to do. This democracy thing is kind of vague. You're going to hold elections? Well, okay. But plus, the U.S. had this idea from Roosevelt that we were supposed to cooperate with the Soviets to create a government for Korea. So we weren't supposed to acknowledge any of the groups that Koreans themselves had formed to be the basis of a new government, because we were to wait until we made an agreement with the Soviets over a new government for Korea. And we have to keep in mind, too, that this was only one of numerous places that the U.S. and the Soviet Union were cooperating or not cooperating, but were interacting over the post-war settlement. So there were so many places that were under discussion and that had to be reorganized after the war, the places that had been occupied by Germany or by Japan. That was most of Eurasia, or a very, very big chunk of it. So, there was a lot on the table. The Korean question was only one out of dozens of questions that they had to work out.
Well, let's walk through some of those early complexities, some of those early challenges. And you mentioned the idea earlier of trusteeship. And, of course, it's spoken early, and it gets a little bit of play, but as people can see, the two security concerns of either side is never really going to let a pure trusteeship work, and they stumble around a little bit, and eventually America decides to turn the control of elections over to United Nations. They can't strike a deal per se, so they turn the issue over to the United Nations, and the United Nations put forward some elections for the peninsula itself.
That's right. I think we should talk a bit, though, before we talk about that, about the attempt at this trusteeship thing.
Okay, let's do that.
So there was a great power conference in December of 1945 in Moscow, and they worked out how the Soviets and Americans worked out how they were going to do this. So they would create a joint commission of representatives from the American Occupation Command and the Soviet Occupation Command, and they would consult with Korean political parties and social organizations to create a provisional government. That provisional government would then hold elections for a new legislature, which would create the permanent government. And
just to clarify here, that is a peninsula-wide government, isn't it?
Yes, a government for all of Korea.
Yes.
Okay, well that sounds, sort of all right if it were maybe the British and the French working this out, for some other. But, for the Americans and Soviets to propose doing that is obviously problematical since they had opposite goals. So by the time this is to happen, early 1946, the Cold War is pretty much taking shape. And so the Soviets are determined to have a buffer in Korea. If it's only the northern half of Korea, okay, that's better than nothing. And the Americans are determined that Korea is not going to become a Soviet, satellite state like the East Europeans are on their way to becoming. So, you have mutually exclusive goals there. The way it worked out was that the Soviets refused to consult with any political parties that didn't support the Moscow Conference decision. That was a kind of trick because all Korean political parties opposed the Moscow Conference decision. Of course, because it was, outrageous. Why wouldn't the occupying powers just leave it to the Koreans to organize their government? Why are they going to supervise doing that? But the only Korean political party that voiced support for the Moscow Conference decision was the Korean Communist Party and related parties, because their leaders had been brought up to the north right after the decision and instructed to do so. So they went back to Seoul and voiced support for the Moscow Conference decision, and they were the only ones who did. And so then in the Joint Commission meetings, the Soviets held to this very tightly. No, only groups that support the properly, reached Moscow Conference decision can participate in creating a new government for Korea. So of course the Americans said no, we can't accept that principle, and the Soviets said yes, we must do it that way. Americans said no, we cannot do that, and that went on for a while until finally they just disbanded they just stopped meeting. They adjourned without reaching any agreement. And meanwhile, the Soviets moved very quickly to create a Soviet-style state in the north in 1946. And as I mentioned earlier, they did that in a very organized and effective way. So, meanwhile, the Americans were stumbling around in the South, not knowing at all what they were going to do.
So the American decision to eventually hand this over after the trusteeship, it doesn't get much traction. So they eventually hand it over to the United Nations, and there's a lot of talk about this, and I've heard this a few times, that the Americans only ever handed it over to the United Nations because they knew that they would win the election. But I've got it from your work that this just wasn't the case. And you mentioned it slightly, just touched on it earlier, that America really just wanted shot of the issue. They wanted to wash their hands clean. They didn't really want to be occupying any part of the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah, well, the South was just such a mess. Its economy was in shambles. It was suddenly separated from the larger Japanese economy that had existed when Japan ruled Korea and Manchuria. So that was all one very big economic zone. And now the South is one small truncated part of that. Plus, there were just so many people flooding back to the South, Koreans who had been sent to work in Manchuria or Japan, returning to their homes, or people from the North who knew that they were going to be on the wrong side in a communist-controlled government and they better get out of there. And so they fled down to the South. And then because Seoul was the capital, all political activists congregated here. So political leaders of all sorts of different parties were agitating for their own view of what Korea's future should be. There were armed groups throughout the southern zone, fighting for one side or another. It was really chaotic. Also, Korea was just a sort of tip of South Korea was a tip of this peninsula that was controlled by the Soviets in the north, backed up by the gigantic Soviet Union behind them. It didn't look very feasible for a government in just the southern half of Korea to survive. Both because domestically there was so much turmoil and disarray, and then also just strategically, it's an extremely vulnerable kind of place. So, the Americans had an awful lot to do after the war. They had massive commitments in Europe and in the Near East, and they were occupying Japan and wanted to hold on to the Philippines. And this mess in Korea was just, better get rid of it. Turn it over to somebody else. And the United Nations was created in order to deal with problems such as that. So that was the logical thing to do. Turn it over to the UN. Yeah.
So just before we get to the UN vote, you touched on it there, and I suppose it's a good time to mention this. There's an awful lot of criticism, and I suppose rightly so, of the two powers that occupy Korea at this time. And of course, we shouldn't negate that in any way, I suppose. But you mentioned once that if, for instance, this is just give a good picture of the Korean Peninsula and the sort of turmoil that you mentioned there, that if the two major powers actually had left the Korean Peninsula to itself at that time, then the country probably was heading towards civil war anyway.
Yes, absolutely. Just as what happened in Vietnam and in China, following the collapse of a great power ruling this country, and given the strength of communist movement in East Asia by that time that had grown in the 20s and 30s and 40s, it's inevitable that there would have been a right versus left conflict. There was. It was going on in the South already. There was this civil war happening between the right and the left. So if the two occupying armies had simply left and turned it over to Koreans, that surely would have continued. The communist side was better organized and better armed, so they probably would have prevailed just as they did in Vietnam and China. Yeah. So it's not that the alternative to division was a peaceful, happy Switzerland.
Yes. Yes.
No, it would have been a very difficult history either way. It just would have been different.
Yes. So let's slow walk this forward from the United Nations vote up until the Korean War, of course, which becomes very significant towards the division of the peninsula. So the UN vote happens, and it only happens in the south because the Soviet Union refused to allow access to the north.
Right.
And of course, the government that is then elected in the south claims ownership and governance over the entire Korean peninsula, which sets off chain reactions in the north.
Right. Yeah, that's still the case. In my classes, I show a map that was printed in North Korea just 9 years ago, in 2009. It's a map of Korea. It's written in English. It's designed for foreigners, so map of Korea. And you open it up. It's one of these big fold-out maps. And it's a map of the whole peninsula labeled Democratic People's Republic of Korea. There's no line for where the DMZ is today. It's simply not on that map. So that's the view of the North. All of Korea is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And that's also the view of the South. All of Korea is the Republic of Korea. The territories north of the 38th parallel are illegally occupied territories. Yeah.
Yes, and so this division, I suppose, in many ways becomes cemented at that point. So you effectively have two governments, one in the south, one in the north, both claiming ownership over the entire peninsula. And at this time, as we move towards, of course, the Korean War, there is continual border skirmishes. So it's not like today when the DMZ is actually a real buffer zone. This was a much looser line and much less well fortified line, and is almost constant border skirmishes between troops at this time.
That's right. Yes. This situation is the perfect formula for conflict. Obviously, two rival governments in the same country. And that's what happened. But these border skirmishes were at on a relatively small scale. They were not, a conventional large-scale offensive like what happened in June of 1950. They were quite serious. There were a lot of casualties, but they were border skirmishes, not an all-out offensive. The reason was that the two occupying powers refused to approve an all-out offensive. The Americans and the Soviets both, throughout 1949. Syngman Rhee talked about marching north to reunify the country. Of course, that's what he wanted to do. All Korean political leaders wanted to reunify the country. It was outrageous what had happened. But the Americans made it clear to him that if he tried to do that, they would immediately turn off all support, and South Korea simply would collapse. It was also up to the Americans, we should keep in mind, how much military hardware the Republic of Korea Army had, because the army that was in Korea in 1945 was the Japanese army. And therefore, the Americans and the Soviets got control of all military forces on the peninsula when they defeated Japan. And so what kind of army would be created after that then was under the control of the occupying powers. And so the Americans deliberately did not create an army in the South that was capable of doing that kind of offensive operation because it didn't want to get dragged into a war with the Soviet Union over Korea. And the Soviets were reasoning the same way. They didn't want to get dragged into a war with the U.S. over Korea either, except that they did create an effective army. Beginning in 1948, built the Korean People's Army into a large and well-armed and reasonably well-trained, at least as best they could in a short period of time, force. And then that force in 47-48 was greatly strengthened by the return of some 40,000 to 60,000 Korean communists who had fought with the Chinese. So they returned to Korea, and that was a huge boost to their fighting capacity. But so the situation was, though, that the North remained completely dependent on the Soviets, politically and economically and militarily, and therefore the decision about whether or not to mount a conventional large-scale offensive to take control of the South was a decision to be made by the Soviet leadership, not by the North Korean leadership. That's the same was true for the South as well. And the Americans consistently said no, and they didn't provide the means to do so, so it didn't happen from the South. The Soviets did provide the means to do so, and then finally in January 1950 said yes, go ahead and do it.
And when they say yes, go ahead and do it, it comes after a very long period of Kim Il-sung petitioning for war. And of course, he makes, I think, 2 trips to Moscow, at least one where he spends a month up there talking through the issue. And he is, I mean, not to downgrade this because Sung Min-rhee, of course, is pushing it the same way, but a lot of the reason Moscow gets involved in the war itself is because Kim Il-sung is absolutely dedicated to starting this war, and he has a belief that once the war begins, there is enough of a small spark, like their forces coming down south, there will be enough people in the south that will be communists that will immediately change side, and he says that this war will be finished in a month.
Yeah, we have to keep in mind that Stalin was hardly a sentimental person, especially at this point in his life. So, he's not doing it just because, he wants to support Kim Il-sung's aspirations. He's doing it for the sake of Soviet security concerns, because one of the interesting things is that in the spring of 1949, just before the U.S. pulled out its troops from South Korea, there were war scares, and Stalin took them very seriously. These reports that the Americans were pulling out of South Korea just in order to unleash Sung Min-rhee, that as soon as they pull out, the South Korean army is going to attack the North, and then once they get control of the North, American forces will come back in, and that will mean American forces will be on the Soviet border. So, the Soviets would lose their buffer in Korea, and they really don't want to do that. So it's still a matter of the Soviets wanting to have a buffer in Korea. They already have the northern half of Korea, but it's not clear that they can hold on to that, as long as the South is outside their control. So it's much better position, a much more secure position, if the whole peninsula is under their control. But that's not worth risking war with the United States, because the Soviet Union is not yet ready to win a war with the United States. It's still recovering from World War II. So Stalin was only going to agree to that if it looked like the U.S. would not intervene. And he decided in January 1950 that that was the case. Yeah.
And of course, at a certain point, the war kicks in, and they push down to the Pusan perimeter. And it looks as though they are going to rout this war very, very quickly. But America, through Truman and MacArthur, eventually commit themselves back into the war. And they push themselves right back, of course, very, very quickly to the Chinese border. And this brings a very new element into the division of Korea. The Chinese army and this new Chinese communist nation are suddenly being dragged into this war in Korea.
Yeah, when Stalin said yes to the North Korean attack in January 1950, it was for 2 reasons. One, the Chinese communists had just won their civil war and established the People's Republic of China in October 1949. And then 2, in response to that huge event, the U.S. had reformulated its security strategy for East Asia, drawing a defense perimeter. It called it just to the west of Japan and the west of the Philippines. So everything up to that line the U.S. would definitely defend, but things over that line, not necessarily. And what was over that line was Korea and Taiwan. So Stalin concluded from that the North could carry out this operation if it was well armed enough, especially with tanks. It could gain control of the South quickly, as Kim Il-sung promised it could, before the U.S. would have time to change its policy and get its forces over to Korea and stop that. And then Korea would be a much better security buffer for the Soviets. So that's why he agreed to do it, and that's why the attack was on such a big scale, and the forces of the North were so well armed, because there was the idea that this needed to be over with quickly. But, it's really interesting that Stalin didn't think about how this would be perceived by other Western leaders. He was, of course, formed by the catastrophic war against Germany, as were all of the leaders at the time in the Northern Hemisphere. So he should have known, I think. But dictators have a rather distinctive lack of empathy, and that can harm them. Because what happened was, when this blitzkrieg against the South happened on June 25th, American leaders, British, French, Dutch, Norwegian, Belgian, all over, immediately responded by saying, "Oh my God, it's happening again. This looks like Germany's forceful moves against other countries that led us into the catastrophic war that we just finished. So we can't go through that again. We're not going to do that again. We've got to stop the Soviets in Korea. We can't let them get away with this, because if they succeed in Korea, then they will move into Iran or into Turkey or into Yugoslavia or somewhere else, and it'll just keep going until we end up in World War III." So the nature of the attack, that it was so large, terrified the leaders elsewhere who had been through World War II. And so that's why they immediately decided that they must intervene in Korea. Yeah.
So let's talk through this issue here. So Stalin is, at least in some ways, but also in many ways, behind this invasion, at least through support. He says he won't give troops, though they does give pilots at one point. But
yes.
But he's going to give material help. And for him, I heard you say at one point, he, at least as you mentioned there, he misunderstood how it would be seen in the rest of the world, but he saw this as a low-risk war, but a war that would potentially offer him an awful lot.
Yeah. His support was also personnel for advisors to plan the attack. The Korean Communist Army had been a guerrilla army. They had no experience in conventional offensive campaigns, and so it was critical that experienced high-level Soviet officers come to Korea and help plan the campaign together with the North Koreans, and then they provided all of the equipment and supplies and so forth. But Stalin made it clear to Kim before the war began, or just when they were first discussing it in Moscow, that he wouldn't send Soviet troops no matter what. Right? He said, if you get into trouble, it's not going to be possible for us to send Soviet troops. You must turn to China.
He actually has a quote at this time. He says, "If you get kicked in the teeth, we will not lift a finger."
Yeah, because he's not going to go to war with the United States. That's all there is to it. That condition, held in the fall of 1950. So when the North did get into trouble after the Incheon landing, the successful amphibious landing west of Seoul in September of 1950 that cut the North Korean line in half. After that happened, as U.S., ROK, and the rest of the UN forces moved rapidly north, Kim Il-sung appealed to the Soviets to send troops, and Stalin said, no, ask China. And so he asked the Chinese. They deliberated for a while. However, they didn't immediately agree. It took about 2 weeks because they were worried about air cover. They had to cross the Yalu and they had to enter North Korea, which was completely under the threat of American Air Force. It took the U.S. a while to get ground forces to Korea, but it had Air Force units in Japan that entered the war immediately and played a big role, and then their number was increased, of course, as the war went on. So the U.S. had complete control of the skies over North Korea, and the bombing was devastating. So the Chinese, quite reasonably, argued to Stalin that they couldn't enter the war unless they had air cover for their troops. At that time, China had 0 airplanes, in an air force. They also had been a guerrilla army. They didn't have an air force. They were beginning to create one with Soviet help, but it hadn't yet been created. So it was only Soviet airplanes that could protect them. Stalin didn't want to do that, so there was a lot of hard bargaining in October. Finally, the Chinese entered even without Soviet air cover and performed extremely well against U.S. and ROK and UN forces. And then at that point, Stalin decided to let Soviet air units protect the Yalu River, area, just the strip along the Yalu River. They couldn't fly over the rest of North Korea, but they could protect that area over which the Chinese forces were entering Korea. So what happened, actually, ironically, is that the biggest military confrontation between Soviet and American forces of the entire Cold War happened in the skies over Korea between Soviet Air Force and American Air Force. But neither government wanted this to be known. And so the Soviets disguised their planes as North Korean, though it was clear to the Americans those were Soviet planes. Also, American pilots could hear them speaking Russian over their radio. But the Truman administration didn't want this to be broadcast in the press, and so it was not. And so, so this was kept secret. But it was a huge battle. Yeah.
So with Soviet and Chinese forces here, I mean, one in the air, one on the ground, eventually they push the Americans and the UN forces back to about the 30th parallel. Now this swings back and forth a little bit, but this is a 3-year war. But by 1951, effectively, this is a stalemate along this border. It moves slightly each day, but it's about that there.
That's right.
And one of the important things that you talk about in your work is Stalin's decision to deliberately prolong this war, because he sees it in his interest that he wants to bog America down in Asia for the foreseeable future, to exhaust their resources, and of course he's building up his own at the time, so he sees this competition coming, and he also sees it as an important opportunity to gather intelligence on American forces.
Yes, that's right. This is, I think, the saddest thing I've concluded from my study of these events. We have the record of his meeting with the political and military leaders of the East European Soviet bloc countries in January 1951. He summoned them to Moscow to talk about the situation created by the war in Korea. And he told them that this war is an opportunity for us because Americans will be stuck in Korea for 2 to 3 years. This is a precious opportunity. We must use it to build up powerful military in all the East European countries. He also used it to build up the military in the Soviet Union itself. So, it's interesting to hear him say that in January 51. How would he know it would last 2 to 3 years? No way of knowing that. Well, then we see the record of the armistice negotiations that began, as you pointed out, in 1951, that Stalin intentionally delayed the negotiations, insisted that the North Koreans keep fighting so that the East Europeans and the Soviets would have this period of time to build up their military. The Chinese were also happy for the war to go on for different reasons. For one, it was the best possible military school, as Mao described it. He rotated the units of the People's Liberation Army into Korea because it was such a great training opportunity. They were able to fight against the most powerful armies in the world, but also the Soviets were supplying them with the most up-to-date weapons, and so as they went to Korea, they were learning how to operate those weapons. The Soviets were also creating a modern logistical system for the Chinese so that they could, win the war or at least hold the line. So the war in Korea was transforming the People's Liberation Army into a modern army. And that was hugely to the benefit of the PRC. So Mao wanted to keep it going. Of course, it's North Korea that's suffering the most from this because of the bombing.
Well, that's an important part of this, actually. So you mentioned the Soviet Union and China are more than happy to let this conflict continue. But what we do begin to notice in some of the records here at this time is this dichotomy between this sort of calm approach, this pragmatic approach by Mao and Stalin, and this increasingly panicked Kim Il-sung, who is increasingly asking for an end to the war because he is being bombed from the skies every single day by the Americans. And just on that point about Americans, you've mentioned this, and I think this is important to note, that they get a lot of flack for bombing. And of course, there was all these stats, like 85% of the buildings in North Korea were flattened to the ground. But you mentioned there that people, especially when they run out of options and they're not sure how to win something, which is a desperate situation like a war, and a war that they didn't start and didn't want to get into, they just revert to what they know. And we do that in our lives all the time. It's not, it wasn't malicious in that sense. It was just a desperate and people that didn't have better ideas.
Yeah, well, we have air power, so we tend to think, well, it must work. We have these amazing planes and this amazing ability to fight in the air, so surely it's going to accomplish our goals for us. We keep doing this over and over and over, right? We did that in Vietnam, we did it in Iraq, we've done it in many places. It never has worked, actually. But we keep doing it. Surely that's going to work for us. Yeah.
Yes.
But it didn't.
But it made a huge psychological impact on North Koreans, and especially Kim Il-sung. So as the divisions creeping closer and closer forward, this permanent division here, Kim Il-sung has got a memory engraved in his mind, and many North Koreans of much older generation do, of just being decimated from the skies.
Yes. So it's not hard to to develop a mythology of imminent invasion, the threat of invasion. So the people need to rally around the North Korean government because it's protecting them against invasion from the south. That's a line they've maintained, ever since. It's not hard to develop that kind of storyline after the experience of the war. Yeah.
So the war's been going on here. The armistice is been delayed, and then Stalin dies.
Right.
And almost immediately it is signed, it is done, and the war is over.
Well, it wasn't signed almost immediately, but almost immediately the new Soviet leadership decided to end the war. But then it took another few months because of several things. Chinese leadership wanted to be sure they were in an advantageous position before they signed the agreement, geographically advantageous and politically advantageous. And then South Korea delayed the process because Syngman Rhee was opposed to signing an armistice. He wanted the war to continue so that they could be victorious. It's very unrealistic. But he didn't want to accept that the war would end with no victory. So he tried to sabotage the armistice. So there was some delay. Finally, then it was signed on July 27th. Anniversary was just yesterday. Yeah.
And that brings us closer to the present. So let's begin to round this out with a more modern look on it. So the armistice is signed, and that in effect draws the division that we see today. Right. And over time, that builds into a much more divided DMZ. It's monitored by UN forces on the south. And of course, it's a source for numerous hotspots over the years, and incursions and mines and all sorts of things happen in there. But this is the division that we see today. And what's not missed in all of this is that the war is still ongoing. It's still technically a war between the South and the North, and they both are stuck in each side has very different ideas about what happened in the war, and importantly, who started the war. It may seem common sense to us, but the North Koreans have told a serious amount of propaganda to their own people, telling them that it was the South, it was the Americans that invaded us. We are the victims in this.
Yes. They still maintain that the war began with an attack from South Korea backed by the United States. The war is called the Great Fatherland Liberation War. Great heroic victory under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, that liberated the fatherland from the American imperialists. So, it's difficult, I think, to imagine that an effective peace regime, as it's often called, could be created to replace the armistice if the two sides continue to have such diametrically opposed views of how the war began.
Well, let's jump into that as the final question here, because that's exactly what people have been talking about just recently. The meeting between the South Korean and North Koreans on the border, that first big meeting with Kim Jong-un, that was about, a large part of that was bringing an end to the Korean War and bringing an end to all hostilities. But as you mentioned there are huge challenges there. So I suppose there's a question here, how do you see the future of the division of the Korea? Is there any change likely in the future, or are we going to see it exactly the same way, exactly the same division? So let's walk us into the future, if you will.
Yes, there is already change happening in the North because of significant change in their economic system. Their centrally planned economy fell apart in the 90s after the loss of Soviet subsidies. They ended up with terrible famine the end of the 90s. And in the course of that famine, a market economy was born because people were so desperate to get food so that they would buy and sell whatever they could to get their hands on some food. The regime tried to stamp out this marketization from below, to put a formal name to it, in 2009, so about a decade after the end of the famine, but it wasn't able to do so. And so ever since then, the regime is trying to co-op and trying to manage this burgeoning market economy. But meanwhile, the market economy grows quite quickly. So that, as of now, most of the people in the North get most of their goods through the market, not through the state-supported economy. And this, of course, radically changes their relationship to the state. One consequence of that is that living standards have gone up quite a lot. But as living standards go up in the North, then the government in the North has to continue to keep improving living standards. because expectations go up, right? Standards for measuring, the performance of the state go up. So the government of the North is in pretty severe need of new economic inputs that it can only get through a relaxation of the tension with the South and with the United States. So I think that's why it is seeking improved relations with both South Korea and the United States. South Korea is responding to that very energetically, beginning all kinds of projects that could be significant in the future. Just last week, there were teams from the South inspecting the railroad systems along the East Coast and the West Coast in preparation for possible reuniting of the rail lines, which would be very beneficial to South Korea. So I think that kind of activity can definitely happen because the North very much needs it. And as long as the South is under the leadership of a government that's in favor of these kinds of efforts, that's likely to go ahead. U.S. pressure on denuclearization, that's a much trickier situation. Probably what will happen, I think, is small steps in that direction without the North actually giving up their nuclear capability, but just sort of dragging it out long enough that they can get some kind of economic relief. But yeah, I think it is possible that the two sides of Korea become more economically connected, and with that then become more connected on a person-to-person level. And then we'll see what happens from that.
Well, on that slightly hopeful note there, we might end the interview. Yes. So, it's been absolutely enjoyable, and I will put some links in below this podcast to some of your other works so people can go on and read in some more detail about some of the things that we've been speaking about today. So, Kathryn Weathersby, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thanks very much.